Tonight's distinguished speaker is a career journalist who's written for the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and Honolulu Advisor, and has moved into the historical field. But he's, for tonight's presentation, we can say that he is making a significant contribution to helping us understand the full story of the Battle of Midway, which became one of the turning points in the war against Imperial Japan in the Pacific. His new book, which is there at the back of the room for all of you to have him sign later at the end of his presentation, Joe Rochefort's War, provides a very engrossing story, finely researched portrait of a very brilliant, fiercely independent, and irreverent, some would say, national intelligence expert. And he led the team that cracked the Japanese Navy's communication code. And if he had failed at his task or had not succeeded, I should put it perhaps the other way, working very long hours and tirelessly from a very dark, dank basement in Pearl Harbor, the whole narrative of World War II would have been different, especially in the early years of the Pacific after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Mr. Carlson's appearance tonight coincides also appropriately with the opening of a special exhibit here at the museum, one that explores the dramatic, often frightening months of the first months of World War II, where American forces were finally able to stop the Japanese advance in the Pacific and then slowly, over the next few years, begin retaking territories that had fallen under Japanese control. And this exhibit, which is, I invite all of you to see, has artifacts, oral histories, archival photos from the museum's collections, and it is truly a spectacular exhibit, and it is entitled The Turning Point, the Doolittle Raid, the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, and it's going to run in the Forbes Theater through July 8th, and I hope you all take advantage to see it. Many of our professionals from the museum's outstanding staff have worked together to bring this exhibit to life, along with the related internet microsite, and I think it illustrates very clearly the capacity for innovation and outreach and exhibit design and development by the staff of this museum. I cannot name everyone responsible for putting this exhibit together, but I'd like to draw special attention to Larry DeSers, Seth Paradon, and our lead exhibit designer, John Costa, and I don't know where you all, I see some of you back there, if you all raise your hands and thank them all. I'd like to also recognize our chairman of the board, Herschel Abbott, sitting here in the front row, and he will conclude this evening's program. And so without further ado, let me introduce and welcome our speaker for this evening, the new author in the World War II history field, Elliot Carlson. Elliot?
Thank you, Dr. Mueller, for that swell introduction. And I want to thank the museum board for having me down to New Orleans today. I also want to thank all of you for coming by to hear me talk about this extraordinary naval officer that you see pictured behind me. He has been a ceaseless presence in my life for about 8 years now, and I'm happy to say, never a dull one. It's a pleasure for me to be here today, and a great honor to be speaking on the 70th anniversary of the Doolittle Raid, which set the stage for so many pivotal events of 1942 in the naval area. Just a little while ago, I had a chance to tour the wonderful exhibits in this museum and see some of the remarkable display you have on Midway. And I must say just about all the key aspects of Midway have been visualized. But it reminded me that one of the central elements of that engagement tends to get lost in the drama of that historic clash. Quite simply, Midway is the only battle of World War II that I can think of in which intelligence was fundamental to the event. That is, it would not have happened without code breaking. Yes, the Imperial Navy would have converged on Midway on June 4, 1942, and in all likelihood, it would have seized that atoll. But it would have been a very different encounter from the one that actually occurred. There would have been a fierce, but ultimately insufficient American resistance. The two carrier task forces that Admiral Nimitz deployed to Point Luck, 300 miles northeast of Midway, would not have been there. One carrier, the Yorktown, would have been in Bremerton, Washington, at a shipyard, getting repairs for damage resulting from a 500-pound bomb hit sustained during the Battle of the Coral Sea a few weeks earlier. Nimitz's two other carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, would likely have been 4,000 miles away, on station in waters around New Caledonia, protecting the sea lanes from Hawaii to Australia, which is where Admiral King, who was the commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet, wanted them to be. The fact that Nimitz's carriers were neither at Bremerton nor in the South Pacific was traceable to 24 codebreakers and language officers at the Navy's small decrypt unit at Pearl Harbor, now famously known as Station Hypo, under the leadership of Commander Joe Rochefort. In May of 1942, Rochefort and his team had broken enough of the Imperial Navy's main operational code to detect a massive Japanese buildup in Empire waters. Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, was persuaded by Rochefort's evidence. After a bit of haggling with King in Washington, Nimitz gained control of those three carriers, and he deployed them to waters near Midway, where they could surprise that large armada bearing down on that atoll. They did so and scored one of the great naval victories of World War II, an outcome that substantially turned the tide of war against Japan in the Pacific. Nimitz credited Rochefort in part for that success, and he recommended him for a Distinguished Service Medal. Nimitz's proposal quickly ran into trouble in Washington, and this is where the real story begins. The proposal ended up on the desk of Admiral King. Now, King was a hard man. He enjoyed a reputation for toughness and ill temper. 6 months into the war, he thought the Navy was already giving away too many decorations. King rejected the medal. He did so on the advice of Rochefort's bosses in Washington. These were the officers who ran something called Op 20G. This was the Navy's main cryptology unit in Washington. They told King that Rochefort didn't deserve the medal, that he hadn't earned it. Keep in mind that term, Op 20G. You'll be hearing more about it. Op 20G did perform a lot of vital functions. It directed the interception, decryption, and translation of all foreign naval messages. In the case of the Imperial Navy, that work was done at 3 sites Op 20G in Washington for one, and at two field stations, Station Cast on Corregidor in the Philippines, and at Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor. As officer in charge of Hypo, Rochefort was accountable to that Op 20G group. For a whole lot of reasons that will be clear soon enough, Op 20G's top brass didn't like Rochefort. They did more than torpedo his medal. They derailed his career. 4 months after Midway, Rochefort was relieved of his post and consigned to a Navy backwater in San Francisco Bay. He was ordered to supervise the building of a floating dry dock. He never again worked on a Japanese code in real time. You might wonder, how could this happen? How could this very accomplished officer have taken such a tumble? Therein lies our tale. To unravel the mystery of his decline and fall, we must begin with the man himself. Just who was Joe Rochefort? That question isn't easily answered. Controversy swirls around his character and personality to this day. There are many versions of Joe Rochefort, one of which comes by way of Hollywood. In a few weeks, I believe, on May 3, this museum will show the blockbuster movie Midway. In this film, Rochefort is portrayed by the actor Hal Holbrook as a kind of clown, an eccentric officer who is a loudmouth, speaks with a folksy twang, chomps on big cigars, and ambles about sloppily dressed in a red smock. This movie is very well done, well worth seeing. But the officers and men who served with Rochefort hated Holbrook's portrayal of their old boss. They said he wasn't like that at all. According to those who knew Rochefort, he was a tall, slender, aristocratic gentleman who spoke softly, smoked a pipe at his desk, and radiated a quiet, although bemused, authority. One officer said there was always a humorous twinkle in Rochefort's eyes. Rochefort did have his quirks. He had an acerbic wit and a capacity for irreverence and blunt speech that surprised even his friends. This was his big weakness. He couldn't abide people he regarded as stuffed shirts, usually superior officers that he regarded as second-rate or unworthy. As one friend said, Rochefort didn't suffer fools lightly. So over the years, he stepped on quite a few toes, and he made his share of enemies. Now, he did wear a maroon smoking jacket in the confines of his work area, a cold, clammy place in the basement of the Navy Administration Building at Pearl Harbor. This is the way it looks today and the way it looked 70 years ago. That little protrusion in the middle by the tree is the entrance to Rochefort's basement. This is the staircase to Rochefort's basement. And this is Rochefort's basement. This is the only picture we have of Rochefort's basement because Rochefort wouldn't permit photographers down there. He was very security conscious, so no picture exists of Rochefort's basement during his tenure. As for that smoking jacket, Rochefort said he wore it out of self-defense. As he explained, it wasn't that I was eccentric or anything, it was a practical matter. It was cold down there. Whether he was eccentric or not, Rochefort probably wouldn't thrive in the Navy today. He would have too many things going against him. He was a high school dropout. In the spring of 1918, while war raged in Europe, he decided he wanted to be a Navy pilot. He quit Polytechnic High in Los Angeles to join the Naval Reserve, lying about his age to do so. He was called to active duty almost immediately, devastating his parents who wanted him to be a priest. Joe wasn't cut out to be a priest. He was in the Navy now, starting at the bottom. His first rating was electrician 3rd class. Another obstacle that would hinder him today, as it did in the 1920s, is that he had no college background. Worse than that, he hadn't been to the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Back then, commission rank in the regular Navy was very nearly the exclusive reserve of Naval Academy grads. But he so impressed the various commanders that he served under that he made the leap from Naval Reserve to ensign in the regular Navy, which was almost unheard of for a former enlisted man at that time. The only problem with this was that he now found himself labeled a Mustang. That's Navy slang for a commissioned officer who has come up from the ranks. Mustangs, of course, tended to be at the low end of the Navy pecking order. He overcame this hurdle, but he needed a bit of luck. While serving aboard a tanker, he astonished his superiors with his ability at contract bridge and puzzle solving. And they thought he should be a cryptanalyst. And they had him transferred to the Navy Department for instruction. 4 months after that, his teacher, Lieutenant Lawrence Sanford, was rotated to sea duty. In an amazing twist of fate, Rochefort inherited Sanford's job. At age 26, he was put in charge of the Navy's new code-breaking program, first set up in 1924. All at once, he was running a small group consisting of 1 officer, himself, and 4 civilians. Happily, one of those civilians was the brilliant, if somewhat haughty, Agnes Meyer Driscoll. Everybody called her Miss Aggie. Miss Aggie and Joe hit it off. They became an effective team. Together they broke the Red Code, the name for the Imperial Navy's main code at that time. Miss Aggie went on to become one of the Navy's legendary code breakers and teachers, and she taught some of the Navy's most eminent code breakers in the 1930s and 40s, Rochefort among them. After his 2-year tour of duty was up, Rochefort moved away from cryptanalysis. He had a new enthusiasm, the Japanese language. Recognizing his obvious talents, the Navy in 1929 ordered him to Tokyo to learn the language and to familiarize himself with the Japanese people and their culture. He did so, and he returned 3 years later, fully accomplished in Japanese and ready for his next big assignment. That came in the spring of 1941. With the Pacific War growing more likely all the time, Washington made him an offer. Would he assume command of the Navy's small decrypt unit at Pearl Harbor? At first he said no. He had good reasons. His health had suffered in the 1920s from the intense concentration required to break that tough Navy code. He would come home at night utterly exhausted. He couldn't eat or sleep. He lost weight. He attributed the ulcers he had in later years to his work on the Japanese code in the 1920s, and he didn't want to go through that again. But the offer had come from his old friend and mentor, Lawrence Sanford. Sanford now ran Op 20G, and as you've heard before, Op 20G directed high-post operations from Washington. Well, Sanford persisted, and he finally persuaded Rochefort to take the job. But Rochefort drove a hard bargain. He wanted unprecedented autonomy. He would regard the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Husband Kimmel, as his primary client. That is, he would report his radio findings first to Kimmel and then secondarily to Op 20G. Hypo's new leader now had a free hand to report directly to the fleet commander without Washington interference or looking over his shoulder. This reporting relationship worked well as long as Sanford remained in charge of Op 20G. That changed after December 7, 1941. In the wake of that disaster, Admiral King ordered a shakeup of the Navy's communications and code-breaking units. Sanford was removed and transferred to a lesser position. He was replaced by Commander John Redmond. A little-known officer whose background was in traditional communications. His specialty was the nuts and bolts of fleet radio traffic, the only link between this world and the subterranean realm of Rochefort's basement was that both employed radio equipment. Redmond had no experience in either code breaking or cryptanalysis, but he proceeded to create his own leadership team. He named as his chief assistant Commander Joseph Wenger. Now, Wenger, unlike Redmond, did have experience in communications intelligence. He had served as a radio intelligence officer in the Far East with the Asiatic Fleet. He would soon emerge as the brains of Op 20G. Wenger had a different concept of cryptology from Rochefort's. He thought it should be centralized in Washington. John Redmond loved that idea. It would enlarge Op 20G's scope, even if at the expense of its field stations, cast on Corregidor and Hypo at Pearl Harbor. Rochefort's freedom to report primarily to the Pacific Fleet Commander would be imperiled by the Wenger plan. The Redmond-Wenger concept was supported by a third member of King's leadership team. This was Captain Joseph Redmond. Sounds like the Redmond brothers. Now, Joseph Redmond was John Redmond's older brother, and he was now appointed Director of Naval Communications. This was a key position. Op 20G was a subunit of Naval Communications, and Joseph Redmond was John Redmond's immediate superior. The Redmond brothers now essentially ran the Navy's cryptology function. Well, back at Pearl, Rochefort took a very dim view of the Op 20G makeover. He figured that Sanford had been the victim of Navy politics. He didn't know the Redmond brothers, nor was he aware of Joe Wenger's proposed plan to change the workings of Op 20G. But he suspected that Op 20G and Hypo might be on a collision course. His concerns seemed confirmed by a letter from his friend Sanford. Sanford told Rochefort that a whispering campaign has started through the Navy Department that the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was preceded by some very clever radio deception. The rumor was that Hypo had been suckered by the Japanese, and as a result, Rochefort's team had furnished inaccurate information to Kimmel. Well, Rochefort bitterly resented and strongly rejected Sanford's comments. But the letter touched a nerve. Rochefort had been badly shaken by the Pearl Harbor attack. He had not seen it coming. He hadn't, however, been idle. In late November, he and his team were among the first to see, through radio traffic, a large Japanese armada forming in the South China Sea. They correctly concluded the Japanese were gearing up for a major operation against Allied possessions in Southeast Asia. And Rochefort so informed Kimmel and his bosses in Washington. But he didn't see an immediate threat to Pearl. And so when the attack came, Rochefort blamed himself. He felt he hadn't done his job and that he had let Kimmel down. He would feel guilty about Pearl Harbor the rest of his life. But the whispering campaign marked the beginning of a war of nerves between Op-20G and Hypo that would last for months. It would influence the Navy's conduct of the war in the Pacific, and it would determine Rochefort's fate in the Navy. This war within a war heated up in March 1942 when Op-20G tried to exert greater control over Hypo's decrypt operations. As one of Rochefort's top cryptanalysts, Ham Wright, put it, Washington tried to take complete control and tell us what to do in detail. Well, we'd have no part of that, not any of us, not Rochefort or me or any of us. We knew what we were doing. As Ham Wright's comments suggest, Rochefort enjoyed the backing and loyalty of his Hypo team. These were not easy people to impress. They were a salty mixture of cryptanalysts, math wizards, language officers, cryptologic specialists, odd characters who didn't fit any mold. But they liked working for Rochefort. They liked his sardonic humor, his low-key leadership style. Rochefort didn't like a lot of fuss. He led by example, putting in 20-hour days, occasionally napping on a cot near his office. As one officer put it, Rochefort's example of working around the clock was enough to motivate anyone associated with him. Rochefort espoused no grand theory of intelligence. He was guided by one overriding principle. The intelligence officer's first duty is to tell your commander today what the enemy is going to do tomorrow. That was Rochefort's mantra at Pearl, and he repeated it ad nauseum in the basement. Sometimes it must be said to the irritation of his otherwise admiring colleagues. As the weeks passed, it became clear that Rochefort and his Op-20G superiors had completely different conceptions of Hypo's mission. The Redmonds wanted to turn the station into an ordinary collection agency. They wanted Hypo to intercept Japanese transmissions, decrypt them, and send the raw material to Op-20G for evaluation. At work here was a syndrome we're all familiar with. Washington knows best. Just give us the data, and we'll tell the fleet what it needs to know. Well, Rochefort wouldn't go along with that. Citing his background in cryptanalysis and the Japanese language, Rochefort said, "I consider that I was better fitted to render judgment on what the Japanese intended than the average intelligence officer." So he continued to report to Nimitz first and Op-20G second. The contest between Washington and Pearl intensified in May. By this time, analysts of all of the Navy's decrypt stations had made giant strides in cracking the Imperial Navy's main operating code, known as JN-25B. They all had picked up clues pointing to a major Imperial Navy offensive. They all agreed the attack would be big. Well, they didn't know where the Imperial Navy was headed. Then on May 13, Hypo decrypted a message that revealed unmistakably where the Japanese were going to strike. Back in March, Hypo had intercepted a transmission from a Japanese scout plane that described a certain island in the Central Pacific and identified it with the geographic designator AF. That island fit the description of Midway, located 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii. Now, 2 months later, Hypo intercepted another message containing the designator AF. In this message, the Japanese High Command referred to AF as a site of an impending operation. Rochefort and his colleagues all agreed that the Imperial Navy was going to Midway. No doubt about it. Rochefort promptly told the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Layton. By happy coincidence, Rochefort and Layton were old friends. They had studied Japanese together in Tokyo in the early 1930s, and they trusted each other implicitly. It was through Layton that Rochefort each day reported Hypo's radio findings to Nimitz. Layton was Rochefort's go-between with the Pacific Fleet commander, and he acted in that capacity now. Leighton presented Rochefort's findings to Nimitz, and Nimitz, once he studied all the evidence gathered by Hypo and Rochefort, reached the same conclusion. AF was Midway. Well, that was on May 14. Nimitz passed his judgment to King and waited. He didn't have long to wait. King rejected the idea. He thought any attack on Midway would be a diversion to deflect American attention away from Japan's real target, probably Port Moresby in New Guinea, or the islands in the Coral Sea where the two forces had met 3 weeks earlier. King and Nimitz exchanged messages for a couple of days, but on May 17, the mercurial King did something amazing. He did something he rarely did. He changed his mind. He radioed Nimitz that he now accepted his verdict on Midway. That should have settled matters, but it didn't. Op 20G didn't believe that AF was Midway. John Redmond and his analysts theorized the coming attack might be anywhere, possibly Samoa or Johnston Island or Hawaii itself, anywhere but Midway. Op 20G wasn't alone in its skepticism. The Army didn't believe that Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Navy's combined fleet, would amass so large a force to vanquish a small atoll in the Central Pacific. Secretary of War Stimson and the Army's Chief of Staff, General Marshall, thought the Japanese were gearing up for a massive attack on the West Coast. Adding insult to injury, from Rochefort's point of view, were insinuations stemming primarily from the Army, but supported by some at Op 20G, that Rochefort and his team were being duped by radio deception. This was an echo of the Whispering Campaign in January, that Hypo had been suckered by the Imperial Navy. By May 18, even after getting King's support, Nimitz felt he needed stronger evidence that AF was Midway, and through Leighton, so informed Rochefort. Rochefort met with his team and said, we've got to do something to convince the world that AF is Midway. One officer told him that freshwater supply was always a problem at Midway, and they suggested a plan whereby they would have Midway tell Pearl Harbor that a mishap at its distilling plant had ruined its water supply, and they thought that the Japanese would pick up that message and relay it to Tokyo, that AF had a water crisis. Japanese radiomen took that bait. Their message to Tokyo was heard by US codebreakers in Melbourne, Australia, the site where Corregidor's codebreakers had been evacuated a few weeks earlier. Well, Melbourne passed this message on to Op 20G. Op 20G was as surprised as the Japanese. Rochefort, as was his custom by now, hadn't bothered to inform Op 20G about his plan, what he was doing. They didn't know about the water ploy. But after reading the Japanese dispatch, they had no choice but to accept Hypo's Midway estimate. The case was closed. Nimitz now proceeded with his plan to surprise the Japanese armada, which, as we all know, he did. In the aftermath of that American victory, Rochefort should have been the man of the hour. He was in the eyes of Admiral Nimitz, but not so in the eyes of Op 20G. The Redmonds weren't happy by how their relationship with Hypo was working out. Hypo wasn't playing its assigned role. Op 20G thought it was supposed to do the thinking, but when it looked at Hypo, it saw Rochefort doing the thinking. As if this wasn't enough, the Redmonds were now asked to comment on Nimitz's proposal that Rochefort receive a decoration, the Distinguished Service Medal, then the Navy's second highest medal. They argued against it on a number of grounds, one of which was that Rochefort had not been in actual combat with the enemy. King settled the medal. Relations between Rochefort and his Op 20G superiors steadily worsened, and on June 20, 2 weeks after Midway, Joseph Redmond submitted a devastating memo to Vice Admiral Frederick Horn. Horn held the communications portfolio on King's leadership team. He had the power to hire and fire. Redmond told Horn some real whoppers that the Navy's radio intelligence unit at Pearl, at his hypo, wasn't doing its job. It was faltering, it was failing because of weak leadership. Hypo was weak, Redmond said, because it was headed by a former Japanese language student with no training on communications. Horn didn't know Rochefort, but he did know the Redmonds. Early in 1942, he had appointed each to the positions they now held, so he was heavily invested in the Redmonds. Joseph Redmond's disgraceful memo served as the basis for Horn's decision in October 1942 to relieve Rochefort as officer in charge of hypo. King backed Horn's action and justified it in a letter to a very unhappy Nimitz. King wrote, "Although Commander Rochefort apparently has contributed a great deal to the results obtained by the radio intelligence unit at Honolulu, he appears to have been the main obstacle to full coordination between Washington and Honolulu." Well, Nimitz wrote several letters to King and Horn protesting Rochefort's ouster, but they didn't do any good. King's mind was made up. Not long after his departure, Rochefort was ordered to San Francisco Bay to supervise the building of that floating dry dock you heard about earlier. He did so, and he earned praise for his work from an altogether different set of admirals in Washington. He ended the war years on a high note, working in Washington, ironically, for a subunit of Op 20G. He now headed something called Op 20G 50. This was the Pacific Strategic Intelligence Section, a group of more than 300 officers and enlisted personnel charged with doing long-range studies of Japan's future naval capabilities. Another irony is that Rochefort received this posting through the good offices of an old enemy, Joseph Redmond, still director of naval communications, who now thought Rochefort was a pretty good leader after all. With Redmond's backing, Rochefort was promoted to captain on September 23, 1944. After the war, Rochefort brought his Navy career to an end. He retired from the service January 1947. He died on July 20, 1976. Shortly before Rochefort's death, his top cryptanalyst at hypo, Tommy Dyer, in a newspaper interview, reflected on why Joe had been denied his medal in 1942 and expelled from his post. Dyer said, "I have given a great deal of thought to the Rochefort affair, and I have been unwillingly forced to the conclusion that Rochefort committed the one unforgivable sin. To certain individuals of small mind and overweening ambition, there is no greater sin than to be proven wrong." Rochefort did get his medal. It resulted from years of campaigning by two hypo colleagues, Captain Jasper Holmes and Rear Admiral Max Showers. In 1985, they provided the critical information that convinced the then Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, that Rochefort should have this decoration. On May 30, 1986, in a White House ceremony, President Reagan awarded Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal. Rochefort couldn't be there himself because he had died 10 years earlier. So Reagan presented the medal to his two children, his daughter, Janet Rochefort Ellerding, and to his son, Colonel Joseph Rochefort Jr., Colonel, U.S. Army, retired. Colonel Rochefort is now deceased. In his remarks about Rochefort, President Reagan rightly emphasized his role at Midway. But Rochefort's importance in the history of naval cryptology goes beyond that campaign. His legacy is that he helped shape a concept called actionable intelligence. That is, streamlining communication, bypassing bureaucracy, and using intelligence developed on the scene that tells your commander today what the enemy is going to do tomorrow. As we have seen, that was Rochefort's mantra at Pearl. There is every indication that today's security forces have learned this lesson. In January of this year, the National Security Agency named its new ultra-modern decrypt center on Oahu, Hawaii, after Joe Rochefort. Yet unavoidably, in this more complicated age, new concepts of intelligence are gaining sway. The Navy now follows a doctrine called information dominance. This may well be the correct doctrine given the age we live in. But one wonders if there still isn't a danger of too much centralization, too much bureaucracy. One wonders how Joe Rochefort would fit into the brave new world of information dominance if he were with us today. I raise the question because it seems to me the Navy needs people like Joe Rochefort, people who are cut from a different cloth, who are products of a different career path, and who, when the situation demands it, aren't afraid to challenge their superiors and existing command structures. Thank you. I'd be willing to answer any questions.
If you have any questions, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Leading up to Pearl Harbor, was Hypo really fooled by the Japanese, or did they just not have enough knowledge yet at that time to be able to properly interpret things?
The Hypo unit did its work based exclusively on signals, on radio signals. And when an enemy force does not transmit signals, you cannot get any information on that enemy force. They had to rely on something called traffic analysis, whereby you infer where the Japanese Navy might be based on call signs and on patterns of radio behavior and things like that. And based on traffic analysis, Rochefort, his team at Hypo, and Corregidor had the striking force in the inland sea, where Hiroshima is, 4,000 miles away from Pearl Harbor, simply because they were on radio silence. Yamamoto imposed radio silence in mid-November, and they observed it through their entire trek to Pearl Harbor, and there was no way Rochefort could have detected the arrival of that force. This doesn't mean that Rochefort didn't make mistakes. I think Rochefort's big mistake was assuming rationality on the part of the Japanese. He always assumed the Japanese saw themselves as primarily a regional force, and that they were very dangerous and mischievous in Southeast Asia, but would always be on the defensive against the United States. And they would be because they knew, Rochefort thought they knew, they could not win a war against the United States. And if the Japanese knew that, why would they attack the United States? This was the gist of Rochefort's reasoning, and he was wrong, because Yamamoto thought that way originally, but he changed his thinking during the key months of 1941, that the only way the Japanese could possibly come out well in an encounter with the United States was to strike so hard that the fleet would not only be incapacitated, but America would be demoralized and would reconcile itself to negotiating a settlement with the Japanese.
I know Rochefort was gone at this time. Do you have any knowledge if the station Hypo picked up Yamato's itinerary when he made the trip to Bougainville?
Yeah, it was the hypo code breakers who broke that code, and so informed Nimitz, and Nimitz cleared it with Washington, and Nimitz took it to Halsey, and Halsey said, yes, I can shoot that plane down. But at that time, Rochefort was getting ready to go to that dry dock, and he was long gone by that time. So it was his team, his group. In fact, I think it was Joe Finnegan was one of the traffic analysts who wrote that, and it was his group that broke it.
Yes. In your opinion, would Midway have taken place if the Doolittle raid wasn't as embarrassing to the Japanese as it was?
Yes. Yamamoto already had approval for their attack on Midway. But once the Doolittle raid occurred, it removed all the dissenters from the Navy and the Army. But the Japanese Naval General Staff had cleared it, but they were feeling uneasy about it. After the Doolittle raid, they just settled it. There was no longer any argument.
Yes, sir. What is it that sparked your interest in Mr. Rochefort?
I liked the guy. I just liked his personality, his character, and the fact he didn't like bosses. I just felt a certain kinship with Rochefort from the very beginning, that this was sort of my guy. And so I just felt in tune with him during the entire time I was doing this book. Now, I don't have a history of terrible confrontations with bosses, but I don't like them too much. And so I just identified with Rochefort. I liked the cut of his jib, you might say, and that was probably what that kinship there that drew me to him.
Why did the Japanese want to attack Midway? Was it preparatory to Hawaii?
They attacked Midway because Yamamoto thought it would be the only way he could draw out the American carriers and destroy them. He felt he wouldn't have a chance to neutralize American power in the Pacific with those carriers still running wild. And those carriers had been causing him all kinds of trouble in the Marshalls and the Gilberts. And of course, the Doolittle raid just put the final stamp on it. But Yamamoto was obsessed with destroying American carriers and force in the Pacific, which he thought would be a precondition, a prelude for America coming around to the idea it would have to negotiate with the Japanese and settle on a status quo, be reconciled to a Japanese dominance there. So that was the whole reason, was to destroy the carriers and draw them out and put them in a position where they would be exposed. And Yamamoto thought he would ambush them. He didn't know that we knew that they were there. And it shows you the importance of intelligence. Their intelligence was terrible. They never did break the American operational code. And they broke some of our weather codes, and they broke some of our diplomatic codes, but they never broke our main Navy operational code.
Are there any more questions? If not, Elliot, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
We are delighted you were here. I'm sure all of us enjoyed thoroughly the presentation you've made. Nick introduced me. I don't need to repeat that, but we do appreciate your splendid presentation. It was fascinating, and we're very grateful for it. It's a wonderful discussion of a very, very interesting individual. And one I'll certainly remember. It in fact, in many respects, exemplifies one of the things this museum tries to do. We are, first of all, here to honor the men who fought World War II. But the second aspect of our job is to educate future generations about the sacrifices that were made to maintain our freedom. And so when we learn about, when you educate us on the characters who are part of that massive jigsaw puzzle that were the American forces in World War II, it really brings home our mission, the mission of this museum, to educate as well as to honor. So thank you very much for that. I know that everybody is going to want to rush back. I hope we've got enough copies of Joe Rochefort's War. Elliot is going to be kind enough to sign as long as his arm holds out, and I bet it'll hold out as long as we've got copies of the book. So it's for sale in the back of the room, and he will be available once I shut up. I want to remind you, Nick mentioned it at the beginning, we've got an absolutely fantastic exhibit on the Battle of Midway. It's immediately behind you and to the left as you head into the museum itself, and I commend it to you. It's an exciting exhibit. It tells a story of the battle that really did turn the tide of war in the Pacific. That battle, together with Coral Sea and Guadalcanal, make up the three battles that set the limit on Japanese expansion in the Pacific and turned the tide. And to learn more, as I said, about one of the people who was instrumental in that is fascinating. Within a year, this is part of the commercial. You can see the structural steel. Sometime in January, we'll be opening the USA Freedom Pavilion, the Boeing Center. It's going to be one of the most exciting parts of this museum. It'll have a submarine Tang exhibit where you'll be able to live the last 10 minutes, I think, of the Tang's existence. It's a fascinating story. We'll have a B-17 hanging from the ceiling and catwalks so you can get up and take a good close look at it. And then in the front corner, you see the construction of the campaign pavilion, the European and Pacific theaters that will open in about 18 months. So we've got a lot going on here. When we get those two open, we'll only have two more buildings in the museum proper, not to mention the hotel and other things across the street. We're still in the process of growth. We're still feeling our way. We're still looking for how we can contribute to the education of future generations, as well as honoring those who served. So with that, I hope you'll enjoy your visit at the museum. I hope you'll spend some time in the exhibit. If you've not seen the other exhibits, you need to do that. If you've not seen Beyond All Boundaries, you need to do that. If you've seen it, you need to see it again because you missed something. Thank you and good night.